Well, hello. Here we are moving into week 10, and here's your introductory lecture. I'm sure you've all just been waiting for this. One of the great challenges facing the church historically and currently, denominations or large units of the church, historically and currently, is the challenge of not wanting to be different from others around us. I remember as a child being reluctant to identify myself as a member of the Church of God. I would have been so much happier to say I'm a Methodist or a Presbyterian. But even to my younger ears, and in my, human development desire to be like other people, saying I go to the Church of God sounded to me as if I were saying, oh, no, I belong to a cult. And who wants to be friends with somebody who's in a cult? The congregation I attended, I want to be clear, was a good and loving group of people. They were good people and they loved Jesus. But it was located on the other side of the tracks, and it had this funny name, and no one I wanted to be friends with had heard of it. It wasn't until I found friends in my teens who attended Memorial Park Church, Reformed Church of the RCA denomination, that I became a little more willing to identify myself as a churchgoer. My parents let me go there on Sunday nights, thanking my parents for that, to their youth fellowship because, well, we didn't have any youth to fellowship. If I were asked, I could now say with partial truth that I attended Memorial Park Reformed Church, which somehow sounded way more cooler to me, and cool mattered. But what's the larger issue here? I can remember when churches of God began to change their names. We became community churches. We became neighborhood churches. We became churches with fancy names. My brother pastored a church that we jokingly called St. Barnabas Road Church of God. And I should point out that we're not the only church body doing this. When I was working at Church of God Ministries, I remember many conversations about these name changes. Why? Well, the arguments were one, to be more attractive to a growing number of seekers and more competitive in the race for numbers, because church growth was, still is, an obvious need for all kinds of reasons. Fewer and fewer marquees proclaimed the First Church of God, Santa Ana, California, where salvation makes you a member. I think it's even possible to read through the Bible this problem of assimilation, the New Testament, and we see similar struggles. Consider the argument about circumcision. The willingness to be a peculiar people diminished, even though in the early histories of the Holiness Reformation, peculiar people was a mark of alignment with the gospel. What is the hesitancy to be peculiar? What does this desire to be like others, where does it come from? What's the reluctance to take faithful risk? There are obvious answers to this, I think. Few of us enjoy standing out from the crowd. Few want to be thought of as odd or strange or different. We don't want people staring at us. We don't want people driving by and admiring our buggies and almost running us off the road. We look at the Amish and enjoy their novels and relish their food, but that's not our calling. Even though the Amish today are closer in their current reality to the roots of the Church of God Reformation movement, of which I'm a part. I think those things are not our calling, we say. But I think a less visible answer grows out of a lack of formation in the life of the church. And yes, this is my hobby horse. I could go on about this at length. It is a burden of my heart. While there may be a kind of reemergence, perhaps, of discipleship in the life of the church, there is an historical de-emphasis on it in the name of evangelism and attention to growing numbers of seekers and nuns. Perhaps we're just too busy to find the time to engage in discipleship practice. But one needs to keep in mind that the apostles spent years in disciple training with Jesus and still struggled with their understanding and their witness and their fears. Recently, a friend of mine said that discipleship is about saying yes, but that this yes requires saying no. Formational practices are demanding, require submission and obedience, and time set aside, and our calendars are full enough, as some of you have already shared. But honestly, I can think of few expectations related to congregational health and pastoral health more important than intentional formational practices, communal and personal. I've already mentioned a few times this definitional statement that pastors are more God-centered than church-centered. I now want to set another hallmark statement alongside that one. The pastor's life touches people and brings them closer to God. Now, this is not to diminish the God-centered affirmation. In fact, I think that pastors who do not focus on their own formational practices, and I've addressed that with a few of you in your responses to the readings for week 9, they are at risk of losing it all. But pastors are pastors of people. They're people who are pastors of people. And the formation of all those people is a primary calling. In the SHAPE manual, this hallmark of a pastor's life touches people is elaborated on with these words. Healthy pastors strive to avoid isolation and are energized for ministry through regular contact with their peers. They and their families are nurtured by biblically based counseling. Healthy pastors are committed to building relationships and are willing to be mutually accountable to others, specifically in peer clusters. So there is this dual responsibility that the foundation of effective pastoral leadership rests upon. Personal formation, attention to God, and communal formational attention to those whom they pastor. These mutually reinforcing assumptions are how a congregation is formed into people who become faithful risk takers, or as more biblically stated, the people of God. Now, I want to take a few minutes here, likely too few for the subject, to talk about a deeper understanding of the mystical nature of the church, something that I don't hear very much about anymore, but seems essential. So much of what we talk about the church falls into the categories of ecclesiology and programming. But the church must also be talked about, and any planning about the church should be in the context of the greater truth of the church. The church was instituted by Christ, who Christ is its Lord. It is the mystical body of Christ. It is not simply or only an organization, but it is a living and divine organism where members are intimately united to Christ. It is both visible and invisible. It is a sign, some would say a sacramental sign, of God's presence in the world and a witness to God's grace. It is of divine origin and divine purpose. It is not a human invention. It is the bride of Christ and a community of redemption. In our ongoing and mistaken perspective that the church is what we do, we must remember that it is God's church and never our church, and our calling and the church's calling is God's calling. The essays that I ask you to read and reflect on in the current assignment in the text, address this mutual set of responsibilities. They do this by thinking theologically about what it means to be the people of God and telling particular stories of congregations that strive to live out of theological reflection in response to specific situations. To pull this lecture to an end and provide a bridge into the essays that I've asked you to read, I think there's no more important statement in this book. I want to emphasize that. This statement, which I'm about to read, which you will find on page 59 in the text, is really the one that covers the essence of the thrust of the whole book. Listen carefully to these words, and I would encourage you to go back and spend some time with them. Like a plant that receives the water, soil, air, and light it needs to grow, when we come to know God's will for our lives, we grow in it and are substantially and materially formed by it, changed and shaped by it. In other words, in faith, God's grace, the form of the holy life, becomes the very stuff of who we are, the water, soil, air, and light of our lives. What this image suggests, the authors say so vividly, is the concrete forming power of grace. To know Christ as persons and as members of the people of God is to live in a certain way, to be disciplined into certain patterns of living, to become persons disposed towards certain kinds of actions and thoughts. And yes, I am strongly emphasizing that word certain patterns of living, persons disposed towards certain kinds of actions and thoughts, to live in a certain way. As these essays continue to stretch our thinking and formation, as they have mine, I pray for traveling mercies for us all. I'm looking forward to our conversation about this important stuff. Blessings.